So is everybody ready to get going?
Think so.
Okay. So at the last meeting, I asked for some homework from you guys. You guys provided some information. Brent provided some information. So that is the version that is attached to the agenda, because those were the changes that were made as of the last meeting. So for those joining us and the attendees, the most recent version is the one on the agenda. Do you guys want to start there? Because I know we got provided a couple of other comments that we can discuss. But I think if we want to focus on, I know we want to keep this portion moving and keeping it forward so we can get it to council. Do you guys want to start there? Go over some of the changes that were made?
Sure. Yeah, let's start there and then we can figure out where we're at.
Okay.
So if you can tell us where the changes were made, because there's no revs, as you said, in the document.
Yeah, I don't know why it didn't come through on the PDF, because the Word document has it and I can't put the Word document onto the website. It just doesn't work quite right. Okay, so one things is there was concern about how do we describe the floodplain. So I added the 0.1 and 0.2 floodplain, so it's very clear that of what we're talking about for the floodplain. And then
actually that should, I'm assuming that should be
1%.
Yeah, sorry,
1% versus 0.2%. They're different orders of
Yeah.
magnitude.
fixing that. Okay, so that's taken care of. Looks like I had a space there too. And then under critical facilities, and I put it under redevelopment as well. You'll see for number 2, there was discussion about how are we figuring out base flood elevation. So Brent provided some information. If built within the 0.2 annual flood chance, the BFE shall be determined in preferential order. The 0.2 zone BFE, the BFE from the flood study, the nearest adjacent 1% annual chance BFE, and just for everybody who's listening, BFE base flood elevation. And then if the lowest grade within the footprint of the proposed structure is higher than the adjacent 1% annual chance BFE, the on-site grade elevation shall be utilized. Because I think that addresses a lot of the concern about how are we figuring that out if you're going to build in the 500-year. And then I know there was concern of like, how do we figure that out for redevelopment as well? If it's redevelopment occurring in the 500-year, which is the 0.2. So I just added the same thing. How do you guys feel about that?
So I think we need to be explicit about the flood study. I'm assuming you mean the AECOM thing. What is that?
No, so in association with the firm map, there is a flood study that the flood map is created from.
Okay. All right. So it's particular to firm. Okay. And so using those terms in that way, that is generally understood that that's what that means.
Yeah, I mean, we can expand. I guess we can call it the FEMA flood study.
Okay. And it sounds like it's a flood study that would be relevant to a particular area that is updated periodically, correct?
Yeah, so whenever you get the maps, you also get the flood study.
Okay.
Just not a lot of people see the flood study because the only thing relevant is the map, in all honesty, but it's the look behind the curtain of how they created the maps.
Okay. Brent, just as an aside, if you could point me in the direction of one of those, I'd love to see what that looks like.
All right.
That can happen offline.
Me also.
You might as well send it to all of us.
Will do.
Or is it something available by link?
I'll look it up. I'll see if I can find the link for it. They usually don't publish it because it's so, I mean, it's a big rabbit hole. But
I just would love to get
I
into
think I
something
have
beyond
it.
a black box, that's all.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have it somewhere.
So do we have any concerns? Do we like that information? Does
Do
that,
we get, is there such a thing as a base flood elevation for a 0.2% flood zone?
So
I've never seen that.
typically there's not in Lewis, but put that in there just in case in the future they come up with it, because the
Okay.
model's getting better. So you want this ordinance to live for a while. If in 5 years the FEMA model gets better and they actually put an elevation on it, then you're covered.
So then it seems to me that a Roman numeral 1 there should say if available or if published by FEMA or whatever. I don't know what the appropriate language is.
well, I think it's covered in preferential order. So if it doesn't exist, you just can't use it. So then you go on to number 2. That doesn't exist, and you go down to number 3.
Right.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's just kind of,
Okay. So we put in the 500-year flood study last time. So in preferential order, then the BFE flood study is the most recent one, whatever that is. Is that correct?
Correct.
There's only
Yes.
one official floodplain designation at any one time, correct?
correct.
Yeah.
The
And
FEMA
that's-
has one set of maps.
And currently that's been most recently updated in,
2015.
okay. And failing that, the nearest adjacent 1% 100-year annual flood chance. And failing that, the lowest grade within the footprint of the proposed structure.
If it's higher than the annual 1% BFE. That's how I read it.
Yeah,
But elevation wise, those are stepping down in elevation. Because, I mean, for example, if it was a rivarian environment and there was a 0.2% BFE, it would be at a higher elevation presumably than the 1% BFE.
Again, this is
So-
just how to determine the BFE, because we're
Right.
talking about the 500-year does not typically have a determined BFE. So the last meeting, there was discussion of like, how do we determine it? So these are the criteria of how do we figure that out
Okay,
and what
so
to use.
then I assume that when we talk about the elevations further down, we're going to put additional factors on depending upon which one of these 4 criteria you used.
You're in order, you use the highest order one you can, correct?
Correct.
Right, but for example, for argument's sake, so there is no BFE for the 0.2% because we're a coastal environment, but there are BFEs for 2.2% in rivarian environments. So let's say we were in Ellicott City. Just choose a right place.
Riparian areas?
What's that?
In what kind of areas?
Rivarian, a river valley,
Riverine.
riverine,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
And FEMA does publish flood elevations for the 500-year event in river valleys in most cases. So if we were in Ellicott City and we wanted to assure that the buildings didn't get flooded, we would be using the 0.2% BFE and adding our elevations, our sea level rise, our freeboard on top of that. But let's say for some reason Ellicott City did not have that number. If they revert to the 1% chance of flood, that is a lower elevation. It's not going to give the same security level. So we would really need to throw in some sort of, for a technical term, fudge factor to account for the fact that we're using a less conservative base flood elevation. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
it
You're
all seems to
basic-
hinge on the defensibility of the FEMA analysis. Am I right about that, Brent?
yeah, but so you're going to the 1% BFE anyway, which let's call it elevation 9 in some areas where the ground's already at 4. So you
Right.
have a fudge factor built in there. Then we're adding the sea level rise projection of whatever, and then you're adding the freeboard on top of that.
So I think this actually does provide, I mean, again, this cannot cover all scenarios, but I think what this provides is includes the fudge factor, and it provides the best available information for, again, we're only talking about the 500-year, the areas. Because if you're in the 100-year, different criteria. This is if you have to build in the 500-year, which again, we're encouraging you not to build there. But if you have to, this is how you're going to calculate base flood elevation, plus your freeboard, plus your sea level rise. So you're still going to be in compliance and providing good sea level rise compliance to make sure that the building and structure is sufficient for sea level rise.
I'm not convinced of that. And while we say you shouldn't build if you don't have to, things like telecommunication and such, there isn't going to be a choice. I mean, this includes cell phone tower structures and equipment. And that is critical during a rain event or a flooding event that stay up. And I like what you've done relative to the 4 different options, but I don't think they're equivalent. And I think there needs to be something to make them of equivalence.
They're not equivalent because the base flood elevations aren't equivalent.
Right. And we're not, but we're using these because we need something to start with as the foundation that everyone agrees on. So if the 500-year floodplain is here and the 100-year floodplain is here, and we're saying this one, we don't know, we don't have a firm number for that, but we do know that there's a several foot offset. I mean, that's a given. Starting with this and saying we're going to use the same equation as if we had this number isn't giving us the same security for the building or structure.
So that's why you have the sea level rise projection built in and the freeboard built in.
But that same sea level and freeboard is built in if I was using this elevation or this elevation.
Or your socks are wet.
So right now, if you want to build in the 500-year and there is an elevation, you build to the 500-year if you didn't have the freeboard. So you're building in the sea level rise and the freeboard on top anyway.
Hold on, is that true? I thought the freeboard was required regardless.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you didn't have that, if you were in a different community and they didn't have freeboard and all that.
But we require the 18-inch freeboard regardless of, I'm just concerned that we're
Right, so
creating
the
false
further
equivalence.
away from the flooding hazard, the less likely you'll be flooded. So that's why the 0.2%, you know, you're typically only going to find a foot difference there.
Wait, so you're saying the general layout of the 500-year floodplain versus elevation, those areas only tend to be within 1 foot higher in the landscape than the AE classes?
Given how they calculate things and everything's an even number, I'm going to say that they're just a foot higher.
Okay.
So if that was the case, Brent, that's very good, is then item Roman numeral 3 should be the nearest adjacent 1% annual flood BFE plus 1 foot. To get us back to, so that we're equating apples and apples.
So at some point, there's the life expectancy discussion as well.
But that
And
applies to
you're
all of
going
them.
on a 500-year storm. So this thing could be constructed, demolished, gone at the end of the day, and never have any effects from flooding.
And again, in this instance, we're using the 80-year sea level rise projection, which is one of the largest we're using, the farthest out. So we've got that built-in extra about another foot for that area already included because of what it is. So because most of the places we're looking at the 50-year, the 40-year, but for new construction of critical facilities, it's the 80-year. So we're already building it up above even more than other items.
Right, but that's true for all 4 of these. Am I the only one who's not getting this?
So a lot of times
You
your
are not
actual
alone.
elevation is going to be way less than the base flood. So I mean, the only reason it is in a flood zone is if the water is going to be higher than the grade. So
Right.
no matter what, you're kicking it to that elevation to start.
Right,
So if and when they come up with a 0.2 elevation, that'll be used. Until that point, we can't assume that there's a difference. Maybe the 0.2 elevation is rounded and it's the same exact number as the 1%.
well, first of all, let's, in all the experts I've spoken to at both FEMA and DENREC, there will never be a 0.2 flood elevation for a coastal environment because it's too dependent upon wind directions, dune structures. There are too many unknowns that they're ever going to be able to calculate that with any level of certainty that you'd want to hang your hat on or build your foundation to.
Right. And with all that uncertainty, you don't know that the elevation is going to be different. So it's hard to build in an additional fudge factor when there may not be even a difference between 0.2 and the 1%.
Can I throw, the way I look at it, I mean, I think this is the challenging thing. And if we're all having this kind of trouble, I can only imagine what it's like for a general citizen to try to negotiate the language we've got here. But my understanding of all this, and this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in getting into that black box, Brent, is, basically the way these maps play out, we're looking at these maps as a 2-dimensional representation of reality. So there's a line on a map that says either you are in or you are not in, say, an AE zone, AE8 or AE9, whatever it might be. And then in some cases in our area, there are areas beyond that, sort of uphill of that, horizontally distinct, that are in the 0.2% class. They're mapped in a sort of a tan color on the Delaware flood mapper. They are further, if I get this, they're further upgrade, basically uphill than the 100-year zones, the AE zones. They're less likely, they're shallower. They're going to be in shallower water in a given flood, right? So the greater damage will occur in the AE zones. The water will be higher in the AE zones and it will be in the adjacent 0.2% zones, am I right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Tom, and I'm all for being as conservative as we can be, because I think I've sent a couple of these articles to you guys. I mean, the stuff that just came out this week on the ice melting rates, we may want to be rethinking which of the levels, which of those curves we use. It's likely that the sea is going to be rising faster than we thought even 10 years ago, based on the way ice is melting right now on land. But that's a topic for another day. I'm all for being as conservative as possible. But I mean, I also, I'm trying to imagine what this is going to look like in the real landscape here. I mean, we got a lot of air underneath some of these buildings now, the way we're laying it out. And I think we need it.
Yes, but remember, a lot of that air into the buildings is because of providing parking, not because of base flood elevations.
Oh, I'm saying in this work that we're doing right now.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
All right.
we're talking about some hefty heights to the first floor.
Yes.
I mean,
I
Brad,
just think-
if I got it right, I mean, am I looking at this right in terms of, you know, for any given flood that will happen in the future, the water will be deeper in the AE zones than it will be relative to grade in the BF in the 0.2% areas.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
So look at it this way. The only thing that's required to be done in the 0.2% now is freeboard. What you're doing is effectively picking a BFE, whether it's for the 0.2 or the adjacent 1%, which is going to be higher than the grade, and adding the sea level rise and adding that freeboard. And if your grade is higher than the adjacent 100 year, then you're already above the BFE for the 100 year anyway.
Now the
So
freeboard.
if your adjacent BFE is for the 1% is 8 and your current elevation is 8.9, you've already got a 0.9% or a 0.9 foot head start to go from there and add on.
What do we say about freeboard in this zone?
It's required in the 1% and 0.2%.
Correct.
Okay,
And it's currently 18 inches.
right.
So, and again, we're looking at the 80 year, which is approximately 3 feet plus the 18 inches. So if you're building in the 0.2, you're going up almost 4 feet.
I actually think that what you have there as written for the critical facilities is pretty good. If you read the whole thing in its entirety.
And
With
you know,
the
I guess,
addition, because again, we were just trying, the last time we met, it was how do we figure out freeboard and base flood elevation for the 0.2, because it doesn't exist. So Brent put on his engineering hat and came up with some ideas of the best ways to figure out how do we figure this out. And I think it does. I mean, again, we don't have specific numbers, but I think this provides the best information that we have and the best way to get to how we figure out that information. And I also added it because there was the conversation about redevelopment as well. Even though most of the redevelopment will probably be in the 100 year, but I added it to the 500 year just in case it happens. So it's the same kind of thing. If we have redevelopment that again is meeting that substantial damage or substantial improvement definition, then we're adding that in the 500 year, we're adding that information as like, how do we then protect that building going forward when it gets redeveloped?
Well, I for one don't feel comfortable because I think, without beating a dead horse, I think we're creating a false equivalency between Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. And if I totally agree, Brent, with what you've done of getting us to something that is a hard fact to start from. But I'd much prefer that we then try to adjust from Roman numeral 3 to Roman numeral 1 with some sort of offset.
How do we do that without being arbitrary?
Well, I think to Brandon's point is if you look at some of the historic 500-year flood maps, which existed prior to this, you can look at what the offsets were. Or I don't know if there's any better studies out there, but we're saying that, but by saying that we're defaulting to Roman numeral 3, we're saying that there is no 500-year, that the 500-year floodplain is exactly the same as the 100-year, and there's no higher risk. And that to me seems to be incongruous with what we're trying to do.
So Tom, let me come at this a slightly different angle in trying to make sense of the comments that you all had. I didn't realize where this draft was until yesterday, the one that we're talking about today. I've always tried to imagine, it sort of fits with the graphic that Bob supplied in his comments, trying to look at this as an elevation scheme. Since we started on this, I've been grappling with how do we just determine a base elevation below which we are uncomfortable, wherever it might apply. It seems to me from what you're saying, you're imagining a certain height of water that will cause problems wherever it may cause problems. And I'm just wondering if we want to simplify this and choose an elevation above NAVD 88.
So
I realize that it doesn't fit well with the FEMA language, but it sounds to me like that's where you're going, Tom, isn't it?
No, I'm really trying to provide an offset between the 1% and the 100-year and the 500-year flood.
So, and
You
again,
can arbitrarily pick something like a foot.
and I think you've already kind of done that, because the 500-year is actually a less impact than the 100-year flood. And for the 500-year, we've picked the 80-year sea level rise. For everything else, it's the 40-year sea level rise. But if you're in the 500-year, we want you to use the 80-year sea level rise. So we've actually already, in the 500-year, which is the less impact from a flood because it's the 500-year, still can flood, still can have massive impact, but we've already added that 80-year sea level rise range to it, which is much farther out, which is a lot higher than the 40-year. So I think your fudge factor is already there that you're concerned about. I think this addresses, it's like, okay, again, like Brent said, odds are is if you're in the 500-year and you build to the 100-year and you're already starting out at a different level, plus the 80-year, plus the freeboard, I think you're going to have adequate protection from what we have currently
Then why don't we do away with Roman numeral 1 and just go to Roman numeral 3?
Just in case in 50 years, when this ordinance is still living and they come up with a 0.2 elevation, it's there.
If we're saying it's going to be, if we're saying we're happy with building to the 1% flood elevation only with these additional factors, I'm being facetious in the argument, but all right, I tell you what, if Bob and Sumner are okay with this, then we'll just bring it to Planning Commission and we can see what this census of Planning Commission is. I'm not comfortable with this.
Okay, so maybe we need to chew on this a little bit and think about it based on the conversation today. But
so how
hold on
else
a
would
second.
you I'm sorry, can I interrupt Sumner real quick?
Sure.
And I apologize. How else would you like to figure out how to determine the BFE in the 500-year floodplain?
I like what Brent has prescribed here. I think that's excellent. I think what needs to be added is an offset to get these to an equivalent elevation.
You're also assuming that there's a different elevation. So everything in FEMA is rounded.
Right, I understand.
So, you know, you might have the 0.1 at 7.4, the 0.2 might be at 7.6 if they ever
Absolutely.
run the model. But
Right,
doing
but
a
that-
prescriptive foot difference isn't. So there's already fudge factor in the 1% BFE.
That's the way we do engineering.
Right, but I'm saying it's already built in there.
Well, I mean, you could add to the Roman numeral 2 there, you could say plus 1 foot. Okay, and in a new construction, it doesn't matter all that much. I mean, it's a better
I'm
view.
just gonna remind everybody again, this is the 500-year floodplain, which
I
is
understand.
it is now we are making a more strict requirement than the 100-year floodplain.
Well, I
Because
understand.
again, this is just
But-
how do we determine the base flood elevation for because we all had the concern is like, okay, we need to protect and make sure we're building in the 500-year, but then how do we figure out the base elevation? Because as we've all noted, it doesn't exist. Hopefully in the future, 20, 30, 40 years, it may exist. But I kind of agree with Brent. And I don't think we need to add an additional fudge factor because I think we've already got several fudge factors in there. One with the
I
80
guess
year and one with
I-
if we're using an adjacent, the 1% BFE.
I
We have to get
apologize
down
for
there.
starting. I apologize for starting to use the word fudge factor. I think we need to get away from that.
That's why I asked
I
the
think- I
question
think-
about arbitrary. I think it's tricky.
Yeah, rounding errors, uncertainty, whatever, you know. But Brent, to your point, yes, it could be 7.4 and 8.2, but it could also be 7.9. I mean, that's the whole thing with rounding is, it's because of the numeric uncertainty that you round things to significant digits. So I think that's more what I was looking for is something to get these, like what Bob had done, to a common elevation of that item Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, and 4 would all wind up coming up with the same elevation as the starting point within our capabilities. Because right now we don't. We have Roman numeral 1, we have Roman numeral 2.
So to that point, if we do get a 0.2% chance flood, that's going to be the elevation that's going to occur in the 1% area as well. So water elevation is going to be water elevation.
Yeah,
This is the
So-
point I was trying to make earlier.
Why would we make it a finished floor higher in the 500-year than it would be in the 100-year?
well, I think Tom is saying use
Because
what
if
you
we add an
have
extra flood
and-
factor, then we're going up higher than we are in the 100-year.
No, I don't think so. I think what Tom.
Yeah, you are. If you run the same calculation, if the BFE that you use is the 1%, and you add a foot to that, and then you add the sea level rise from 80-year versus 40-year, and then the freeboard, you're going to end up with a higher finished floor in the 500-year than you would the 100-year. Because you've done 40-year versus 80-year, and you've added that foot in there.
Would it help before we present this to even the planning commission, let alone city council? If we're going to have to generate some graphics that show some of the details that you're talking about here. We're going to need to be able to portray the heights and the way it works in a map, working around the areas that we know are of concern. It seems to me that some graphics here might help some of this. I mean, I agree with what you're saying, Brent. That's why I asked the question a while ago, and I didn't do a very good job of explaining it. But the water level is going to be what the water level is, right? We're not going to have higher water levels in the 0.2 than we are for any given flood event.
Right.
It's going to be a flat surface, and presumably the 0.2% areas are a little higher in the landscape than the AE areas are. As time goes by, some of the 500-year 0.2 areas may very well become part of AE or not. I don't know. I mean, it seems like every time they do this, they change the lines. But I'm assuming the expected greater damage will occur in the AE. That's the whole point of the lines.
So if you're a foot into the 0.2% now, and you wait until a map revision and it goes into the 1%, if you were to follow the code today, your finished floor would be 2 feet higher than it would be after a map revision that you're put into the 1%. So you would actually have a finished floor lower if you get mapped into the AE. If we do an extra fudge factor, I think what we've got is fairly substantial when you're going with the 80-year projection. And like you said, your ground is higher already anyway. And there's a good chance that it's strictly, I'm not going to say out, but they do a blanket swath for the 500-year. They're not taking every little individual mound. So if you put whatever facility on the high part of the property, there's a chance that elevation, that if you go down to number 4, that it's already out of the BFE. But
Sorry, go ahead.
But I feel like, in the 0.2% chance, we've got a pretty good, call it a fudge factor, call it a safety factor, call it elevation difference, heightening elevation above what it should be. Got a pretty good bit in there. So, I mean, you're projecting the sea level rise at 3 feet anyway. So if we got the 0.2% on ribbon cutting day, the theory is that you would be 4.5 feet out of that flood elevation immediately. I know we're projecting into the future, and that allows for that sea level rise, but
I'm going to ask a really dumb question here, because I think I sent it to everybody. I went back just trying to understand a system that sort of puts this all together, and spent a lot of time looking at the Norfolk work, and clearly they've got a much bigger city, they've got a lot more resources to throw at it, everything else. But somewhere in there, I got the impression that even in Zone X, there's a freeboard requirement. Do we have such a requirement here?
Not in Zone X.
not in X.
Not in X. What Norfolk did was, if you were commercial, you had so many feet of sea level rise and freeboard, and if you were residential, you had so many feet of freeboard and sea level rise. And then there were ways to look at that with a numbering system and some best management practices, which I think,
For the resilience quotient.
yeah, which we kind of took into and we added to the redevelopment, which is our best management practices for lot coverage. So we've kind of taken bits and pieces of theirs, but they really just did flat across the board, increase this many feet. They didn't look at 40-year, 25-year, 80-year. They just said everything 3 feet.
And so to that point, they're also looking at a slightly different accelerated
Correct.
sea level rise, and they're sinking a lot quicker than Lewis is.
Yes.
Over 100 years, they're probably going to lose 8 inches just on subsidence. I'll put Robin on the spot on this, but I think you pretty much have to build above grade anyway with our current building code. So while it's not a straight prescriptive 18 inches of freeboard in zone X, you're not going to go out there and just even a slab on grade, you've got to build it up to adjacent and have a certain amount of fall around the building, which kind of builds in, you know, the raising thought process.
Somewhat of a freeboard in X is what you're saying.
Right. Yeah.
It seems to me, I think there's something, and maybe if Robin can confirm this, there's something in the building code that says 6 inches from grade to structure.
Yeah. So you've got to fall 6 inches in the first 10 feet outside, or
Yeah, I remember that someplace in the building code.
Robin, if you want to jump in, go for it.
Yeah, what Brent just said is correct. Yeah, and what Tom said, yes. It's a 6 inch at 10 feet for the grade from the building.
so you've kind of got it built in there in that thought process. It's not as substantial as what they've done down there in the Hampton Roads area, but they're right on the nose of it. And they're losing ground quickly every day.
Are we really different than that area
So
in terms of the rates?
versus other parts of the country, no. Versus in a microscope, us versus them, yes. So we're in the same similar geological area, so to speak. But when you compare us to, say, up in New Hampshire and Connecticut, we're a completely different ballgame than them. We're closer to Virginia Beach than we are up there, but we're not. They're looking at, 6 to 8 feet in 100 years, and we're looking at 3 to 4 feet. Connecticut's looking at a foot.
That just doesn't sound, it sounds like one of us between here and Norfolk is off. I can't imagine that we're that different than Norfolk.
It's the bay, it's the subsidence, it's the quick land, it's the fact that they're built on a lot of silt, and the way it sits, it's.
Yeah, there's a lot of other factors that go into it that impact it. But based on all of the science and research that's been done, there is a difference between them, us, and then as you go farther north. And again, we're using the best information we have based on the state's information, which again, they continually update. So if something changes, but they don't predict that significant of a change. So, I mean,
Yeah.
So are we feeling a little bit more comfortable with the proposal for how do we figure out base flood in the 500 year?
Well, actually, what Brent just said, I've got to go back and rethink because I do take what you said, Brent, about the 100-year and 500-year elevations, but it's just confused my brain more now.
Okay, so let's put a pin in
So
this one and we can come back to this next time if you want. Does that sound better? Everybody kind of take this in, think it over. Is that going to make everybody a little bit more comfortable?
I think so. I just want to make a comment on what Brent and Janelle were saying about the differences between us and Norfolk. I think the main difference in terms of the 6 foot number that Brent put out versus our 3 foot thing. I'm just looking at the NOAA sea level rise viewer to try to make sense of this all while we're talking. The difference, I think, comes down to which of the different sea level rise scenarios they're hanging their policies on. So we, for example, chose the blue line, the intermediate line, which in Norfolk is 4.56 foot figure for the year 2100, and Lewis is 4.33 feet in 2100 for that same scenario. If you pick the intermediate high scenario, Norfolk has a 2100 seawater elevation of 6.59 feet. So it's a matter of which sea level rise scenario you hang on. It's not that the sea level is rising differently, it's just that they've chosen a different number. So, you know, we can do that same thing here.
The number you choose to plan for. All right, what if we do this? What if we all think about this? Tom's raised the point of sort of adding something to points 2, 3, and 4 to bring them back up to the 500-year BFE, whenever it exists. And, you know, that sounds like it would be a foot. But Sumner asked for a graphic, which would be, where are these 3 lines at some point in Lewis versus the, I guess, the datum 88 or something like that.
Well, I mean, I think some of the problem there is it's situational. It depends on which
pick a
on a
spot.
map you're in.
Pick a spot.
But every spot, I mean, I think the whole problem here is that, you know, if you're in an AE zone, it's one situation. If you're in a 0.2% zone, it's another. And if you're just outside of the 0.2%, it's a whole other matter.
Right. Again, like if you're in the 100-year, your base flood elevation for my house could be, you know, one number. And for my neighbor's house right next door, it could be a foot difference or a half a foot difference. But I build to what I have. My neighbor builds to what they have, with the sea level rise and the base flood elevation based on our base flood elevation. So they're all going to be slightly different based on what my base flood elevation is, what my neighbor's base flood elevation is, and the one next door, because while we're relatively flat, we do have some differences. So if I'm like at 8 and my neighbor's at 9, when I put my sea level rise and my base flood elevation, I will be at a different level than my neighbor because of what I'm starting off with. So I think if you're trying to have a level of everybody starting at the same thing and in a graphic going, everybody's going to end up at the same place, they won't, because every place is slightly different.
Yeah, and Janelle, you're absolutely right, because I mean, the 100-year flood elevations are basically a topographic, and so they step change. And we know water doesn't step change, but that's just the engineering representation of a curved surface. And so you can have 2 houses next to each other that have a 1-foot offset. Brent, correct me if I'm wrong. There are, I believe, 2 data points that we have for 500-year events, which are both located out in the bay. Is that true?
I don't know.
Because I think when I went through this at one point with DENREC, they said that there was a bay and an ocean point, which are not land-based, but they're, and for 500-year storms. And it would be interesting to see what the delta is between the 500-year and the 100-year for those data points. And my recollection is they were 1 to 2 feet apart.
Yeah, open water is going to act differently, you know, depth and wave and surge and,
Right.
You know, you can go with the rule of thumb that it's a foot difference just because of the rounding and the engineering step and everything, because it's easy to digest, it's easy to understand. You know, I'm not going to call it the simple way out, but it is the simple way out without, you spending 45 minutes trying to figure out how to run the calculation. If you just call it a foot, it's a foot. Yeah, I'd be curious to see it.
I'd be willing to accept the foot.
All right, let's digest this then and move on.
So those were the only comments that I got, except for some minor things about this section of code. So if anybody had anything else, let me know, because I think once we get past this, how we determine base flood elevation, I think you guys are ready to go back to the planning commission and get this going for a public meeting, and then recommendation is how, again, once we figure out this base flood elevation for the 500 year, are you guys comfortable with everything for critical facilities and redevelopment? Because I made the minor changes, Tom, you had about that.
Oh, so you changed, you did. In other words, all of the items 1 through 6 that I put in are changed in the code, the draft?
Again, one, I just put the 1% and the 0.5. I went with how for calculating the base flood elevation, I went with Brent's suggestion. And again, this is, I think a lot of the stuff that you were talking about is what we've been talking about, is how do we calculate base flood elevation. So I went with the suggestion from Brent, which is some of the stuff that you brought up. And then, yeah, I took care of 5 and 6.
So, I mean, the first item was the fact that the code talks about special flood hazard area, not flood plain.
Yes, and I talked to Robin about it, and that we added floodplain and we added the 1% and the 0.2%, which takes care of your concerns.
That's all contained within this resiliency language, or you're saying out in the broader relevant sections of code?
So you had concerns that we just said if you fall into the floodplain and wanted additional specifications. So we added the 1% and the 2% floodplain. So if you fall into the 1% or the 0.2% floodplain, you're subject to this section of code. So that's been addressed in the version that's online.
Okay, so just so Robin's okay with 1% and 2% is completely clear that that's the A, AE, A0 and VE zones?
Yes.
Okay. I want to make sure that we stay in tune with the definition section of the code. And add a definition of how to calculate the required elevations.
And again, that's what we've been discussing.
I would just add, if we're going to keep it in there, call it the flood insurance study.
All right, that works for me. Yeah, something that means it's an official study rather than some other third-party study.
I added FEMA flood insurance study. So that should cover it, correct, Brent?
I believe so.
Perfect.
I sent the link to everybody for all 3 sections of that thing.
Thank you.
It's the middle one was 21 meg, so I figured the email system wasn't going to like it very much.
Thank you, Brent. I picked up the first one. I haven't looked at them yet, but thank you. All right, so I'm a little confused as to where we are and what we're doing.
Okay, I'm okay with that then.
Okay, and then I took care of 5 and 6 with just capitalizations, and I've run this, and Robin is working with us, DEMA and FEMA. So once we get a final draft, we will send that off to them for their comments. Actually, they'll do that after Planning Commission makes a recommendation. because then it's tweaked even finer, just in case the planning commission makes any changes.
So far, Robin, I take it that we're not out in la la land here. We're doing reasonable things.
Yeah, it appears.
All right, good, thank you.
I just to follow up on what Janelle said, I have a called into David Warga. He's the state floodplain manager. I am trying to set up a conference call or webinar or Zoom meeting with FEMA Region 3 and DENREC or DEMA to kind of give a synopsis on what we're doing, not just the sea level rise, but with the fill, with the floodplain, and again, with the proposed 2018 building code changes, because the 2018, there's some additional items in the floodplain section that we might need to look at also. So they all have to be somewhat incorporated together and make sure all these pieces fit.
Right, I think that's critical.
Robin, do we have a summary of the last version of the code I have is 2015 hard copy of what changed in the 2018 in the floodplain section?
No, the problem with that, Tom, is we're using the 2012. Normally
Right.
ICC goes 2012 to 2015, 2015 to 2018. They do not give you really, without looking on your own, to say what's the difference or significant changes between the 12 and the 18.
They just change it and publish it.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
no summary, unfortunately.
Unless you go to the subcommittee notes and then they tell you what they debated. But yeah, and the last code I have is from what I built up in New York, and that was 2015. So
yeah, we would be jumping from the 12 to the 18.
Okay, so anything else you guys want to discuss today? Because we've spent almost a good hour on this. I know we've got some other items for new development. I think there's definitely some options. You guys take a look at that section of code. Tom gave me some comments, so I threw them in there. I can add some additional ideas when we get to new development, because again, I think the intent is to send critical facilities and redevelopment to the commission sooner rather than later, so we can get something into the code, and then we'll come back and look at new development. Maybe we want to do just something simpler like Norfolk and just say, okay, you have to, this is your sea level rise number, 3 feet, 4 feet, plus your BFE, and then maybe do some of like the best management practices that we have for redevelopment as well. Or if we want to do something more detailed that we've kind of discussed, we're good for that. So what are you guys thinking? Just stop here for today. Think about other options for how what we've discussed today for calculating BFE in the 500 year, and then continue to think and get ideas for new development.
I got to say, my head is spinning right now, and I think part of the problem is that while we're talking about all this, I'm also, and it's just a character flaw of mine, I'm trying to connect this geographically because they do overlap with other efforts. It sort of gets to some of the things that Robin was saying, in addition to what we're doing here with sea level rise, there's all the stuff going on with flood, the fill and the floodplain stuff. And then now I see, we've got this source water protection thing going, which also sort of functions in some of the same geography.
Yes.
Which makes me wonder if there isn't a way that we can be better coordinating all these pieces, especially when we're, I don't know, when we have the potential to develop overlay zones where these things happen, we can get it all right in a given overlay zone if it makes sense. And it seems to me that, the floodplain work, the sea level rise work, this source water protection conversation that clearly needs to happen, they're all going to be operating in the same areas over in the Lewis Beach area, particularly. And maybe some other areas in the excellent recharge area over on the Canary Creek side. I haven't really looked at that yet, but
As it relates to overlay zones, other than the source water ordinance, we're precluded under state law from having overlay zones. So we're required by state law to do it for the source water protection, but we're precluded on all of the others. So, and really the source water protection issue needs to be resolved relatively quickly because there's an ordinance in place that is in need of amendment. So I think even if it's amended further in the future, it needs to be addressed in a pretty expeditious fashion.
And Marie, I'm sorry, I didn't realize the state prohibits overlay zones.
Correct.
The reasoning.
Well, there's language in the zoning enabling legislation at the state level that requires uniformity within zones. And in 2012, I think 2012, Kent County was sued for having an overlay zone, and the state Supreme Court determined that overlay zones are not permitted under the part of the statute that requires uniformity within zones.
So if you know, I've been thinking about the presentation that Kay and Janelle made to council regarding the LPC action items, and I think then sort of the way I'm imagining things make sense moving forward. I was imagining overlay zones, and I'm glad that you brought this up because I didn't know that. I guess I'm going to be moving toward the suggestion that we fundamentally restructure our zones so that whatever uniformity there is within them, it makes sense across a bunch of these physical processes which are affecting the functioning of those zones. I don't want to get into it more here, but we'll get into it later, I'm sure.
One idea, and Anne-Marie, I agree 100%. That's Delaware's laws, and it's somewhat different than other states have taken with overlay districts, but that is Delaware's interpretation. But my understanding is that would not preclude something like a special flood hazard district.
Right, that's effectively
That,
an overlay
that would
zone,
not
isn't it?
be that would not be a zoning, and that we could do something under a special flood hazard district that
Yes.
would act kind of like an overlay, but it would not be an overlay.
Well, and so I guess I would give two answers. Our presumption is yes, we can, but it also has not been tested in the courts. So I don't know what the state courts would say about the uniformity zone. I do think that the uniformity within zone, I do think that as it relates to the special flood hazard area, because that comes down through the federal government,
Right.
it would preempt that state.
Right. And
So, but I
FEMA
think if we were to expand it beyond what's part of the federal program, it could make it vulnerable.
Right, and everything-
FEMA does specifically allow for special flood hazard areas
Require it.
outside of the maps they provide.
Wait, say that again, Tom?
FEMA does allow for special flood hazard areas outside of the FEMA maps that they provide.
Developed by a municipality, for example.
Municipalities or state or whatever. And as Anne-Marie said, since it's coming from up high, presumably it preempts the state.
And again, what we're looking to do is everything within the floodplain. So we have an existing floodplain regulations. We're just kind of adding to that for this to provide some additional protection. And I'm keeping an eye out on everything, making sure, because again, you might not see how it all fits together, but addressing floodplain is always a good thing. Addressing sea level rise is always a good thing. My job is to make sure they don't conflict with each other, and I'm keeping an eye out to make sure that doesn't happen.
All right, so how do we resolve this? I mean, there seem to be,
What question do you have, Bob? Resolve which situation?
well, how do we get this to something we can present to planning conference and then hopefully city council?
So I think we need to, what we discussed today and the points that Brent provided, the Roman numeral 1 through 4, we need to go have one last cleanup. And then the next meeting, we need to decide the final wording, or if we're happy with the way it is now, so we can present it to planning commission.
Okay,
And
and as I understand that, Tom, it would be really, you could stay with this wording, you could stay with this wording and start to add something like a foot to 2, 3, and 4,
Mhm.
or some, some relatively arbitrary but safety. Or you could pick some other datum and say, we're all going to be higher than this.
And I would just say that, I wouldn't say that we would choose something arbitrary, but that we would use engineering judgment to determine an offset between Roman numeral 3 and Roman numeral 1.
Okay. And we might get that from the offshore points you talked about.
Or if there's some other place, Brent, that you think we might use as a base for that.
But those are sort of the 3 choices we'd have.
Right.
And there isn't much other discussion on this other than typos and capitalization. Is that correct?
From my perspective, yes.
Correct. I haven't heard anything else. It was just to discuss the main items today was how we're talking about the calculating the base flood elevation. I have addressed everybody else's comments regarding these sections.
I guess I'm just gonna throw this out here. It's never sat right with me, this lot coverage, the BMP piece. But and I think that's why I went and found that resilience quotient thing, and I'd forgotten that had been based in the resilience quotient calculation. But to me, that was a little more rigorous, and maybe it's too rigorous for what we need to do here. This is sort of apples and oranges, and it's never sat right with me that we could just pick from this list. But maybe that's just an imperfection I'm gonna have to live with.
Yeah, because even the Norfolk list, you get points based on doing different things. So we just kind of said, hey, these are the lists. And again, we didn't just randomly pick the list. The list is from numerous reports that have been done for the city. So those best management practices came from reports for implementation from a number of different, the AECOM report, the KCI report. So there was reasoning behind them. So do you guys want to pick a next meeting date? And so I can give you guys a date as to if you have any changes or suggestions to that, how we're calculating the base flood. So I can get that taken care of and then back out to you guys.
Yeah, so the next planning commission meeting is
The 17th.
17th. So I'd like to have it done like the week before, so we can get it to planning commission on the 17th.
So what does the 11th look like? It's a Thursday because that Wednesday's kind of busy for the city. I don't currently see anything on the city's calendar.
What date are we talking about?
Thursday, the 11th.
I'll just double check.
Yes, please.
We've had a couple of things where we've double booked.
Yes, we have.
So the 11th. I
So-
do not see anything.
I'm not available before 10 a.m. So we could do 11. I've got a meeting
for
from
me.
8:30 to 10.
Okay, so Thursday, the 11th at 11.
It's okay with me.
Okay, if you can just get me any comments by Monday. No, take that back, because by the 5th, that way then I have time to get, you guys have some time to think it over, and then I have time to get it back out to you and post it. Actually, if you can get it to me the 4th, that way then it can be actually posted on the
So
Okay.
the end of day on the 4th.
if not sooner, because that way then I can, because the agenda has to be posted. So if I have any changes, I can have that all ready to go for the agenda.
All right.
That's a week. That should be.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
okay.
And Janelle, just to clarify, we're on for 1 o'clock on that day.
Yes.
Okay.
On the 4th at 1.
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay, homework due by the end, as preferably soon as possible, but no later than February 4th, so I can get the agenda posted. Comments on the base flood calculation information, and then we will discuss on the 11th.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. All
Thank
right.
you. Bye.
At that,
Bye.
bye now. All right.